Welcome to the Blender Beginner for Beginners series by Dark Sky Horizons. In this video, we'll be going over 7 tips to start for Blender beginners. I myself only have about a year collective worth of knowledge in Blender, which I know may seem a lot, but really I'm still a beginner. I struggled to start up and had plenty of days where I spent so much time on a project just to find out later I could have done it in a fraction of the time with a single tool. I wouldn't call this a complete list by any means, as there are plenty of useful tools and gadgets in Blender that might benefit you. This list will go over more basic things like need-to-know keyboard shortcuts and hidden features that will speed up your sculpting, modeling, and render times. Without further ado, let's get into it. To navigate and use Blender effectively, you're going to have to get used to shortcuts. Depending on how long you've worked in Blender, you may know some already, but here's a quick list of the basics to get you started. Shift-A pulls up a menu to add anything from the respective list. Shift-D allows you to duplicate. Pressing X on a selected object allows you to delete it. Tab toggles you between edit mode and object mode. G is to move your selected object, while S is to scale. You can also guide these two by pressing X, Y, or Z afterwards to lock it into an axis, like so. 1, 3, and 7 on your numpad will change the orthographic view, while 0 will show your camera view if you have one in your scene. There are plenty of more shortcuts in Blender, and it's difficult to remember them all at times. One thing you can do to help is if there's an action you want to know, hover your cursor over it and it will tell you its keyboard shortcut. In menus like Shift-A, where there is a list to choose from, the underlined letter or letters is what its quick access shortcut is. This next one is a bit more specific and I'll explain why. When you Shift-D an object, what you are doing is duplicating its information in your 3D space, doubling the amount of vertices and in return doubling its processing for the viewport. A few times is fine, but do this enough and your computer might start to bog down, depending on the detail of your object. Even more, if you created a model and duplicated everywhere, then realize a mistake, you'll have to go back and fix that mistake across all of your duplicates, which will take up more time. However, if you use Alt-D, you're duplicating an instance of the object. That instance shares the same information of the original. Although this won't reduce render times, this will improve processing your 3D space in the viewport, and if you realize a mistake, editing one edits them all, which is a huge time saver. If you look at the top of Blender, you will see a row of tabs for different preset modes. These modes are useful for sectioning out the tools so you only have what you need at the time. They're also pretty self-explanatory. Modeling tab is strictly for modeling. Sculpting has all the sculpting tools and brushes ready for you to use. UV editing is for applying previously rendered images to 3D objects and setting up UV wrapping. Texture paint is for using Blender's painting tools to create your own textures. Shading is a combination of the last two and using nodes to create your own generated shaders. Animation is set up for the basics of animation, though I personally believe it's missing some key features, which we will get to in another video. Rendering is for your render result or any other rendered images you have within your scene. Compositing is for adding effects after your render is complete. Scripting is more for Blender's game engine, which personally there are better options. And geometry nodes are much like shading nodes, except they manipulate the 3D space of an object to add cool effects. Definitely something that will need its own video though. Add-ons are additional external tools that give you the ability to add even more options and variations to what Blender already provides. As a beginner, however, I would stray from these additions as they add not only more tools, but complexity, and some can be rather confusing and hinder you in your process of learning. For now, there is one I suggest you activate for future use. Click on Edit and go to Preferences. Click Add-ons and you can see what Blender has to offer. Use the search bar and look for Node Wrangler. This adds a few extra tools when it comes to nodes, which we'll get into that later. When it comes to textures in Blender, there are a few ways to go about it. You can add images from outside of Blender and plop them into an object. You can use the Material Properties tab on the right to make some basic changes. Or you can delve into the wondrous world of shader nodes. Shader nodes have a numerous amount of flexibility when it comes to creating textures for your 3D space. It may seem very daunting when it comes to all of the options and trying to figure out what they do, and let me tell you, it is. But once you get into it, you'll soon realize you're using it all the time to add extra elements of realism to your projects. Unfortunately, there's not too much I can go into depth with shaders right now, since there is so much complexity to it and there's a lot of different things you can do for objects. So for now, we'll hold off to a future video where I get more into depth on shaders. If you're running cycles for rendering, click on the Render Properties tab on the right and you'll get a list of options that change how the rendering process works. A lot of it is fine how it is unless you're doing something specific. But if your computer is on the lower end, I would recommend changing a few things. Render times can get astonishingly high for detailed scenes, and if you're doing an animation, then that time will be even longer. The following is more for Cycle's render engine rather than Eevee, however. Under sampling, change the render down to 64 and viewport to 16. If your computer can handle viewport better, then you can keep it where it's at, but you won't need to be looking in render view as much until the end. What this changes is the amount of samples Blender is processing for your render. The more you have, the clearer the image, but the longer the render time. To get around this, you can go to denoising and check render. This will smooth out your render and get rid of most of that gritty look. You can put this number up to whatever you want if you don't mind the wait time, but I wouldn't go anything over 400. At that point, Blender will have run so many samples that it just won't work anymore, and you're running your render longer for no reason. Next, go to light paths. You want to half all of these numbers. You would think the more bounces, the better your lighting will look, but in reality it won't actually change much and Blender will be processing that information for no reason. Yet again, you can increase it if you'd like, but it's really not worth the processing unless your render is all about light bouncing, like a room of mirrors or something. Lastly, go down to performance and underneath tiles you will find an X and Y entry. These tiles are used to break up the rendering process. You would think that smaller tiles mean a faster render, and in some cases you may be right. But honestly, it all depends on what your scene is like. If you're only rendering a single image, this step may not apply unless your render is going into the hours mark. Do a test render and see where it takes you, and you can change it from there. I wouldn't call this a tip for using Blender, as it is more of a rule of thumb. Don't use detail where it will not be viewed in your final product. I'll explain further. Let's say you have a really cool street view with all the bits added for hyperrealism. You're only doing a single shot for render, and it's just a single view down the street. Do you think all sides of these buildings are modeled in textures in complete detail? No, of course not. Only two sides of these buildings are visible, so there is no point in having the rest in our 3D scene. Although this won't change render time, this will increase the responsiveness of your viewport, and it will save you loads of time knowing you won't have to do extra work on something that won't change the final product. To put this simply, plan ahead. I spent plenty of time on projects not really knowing what I was building it for, only to realize I did a lot of work for no reason because I put so much time and effort into a part that wouldn't even be really visible in the end. You can take this further by reducing quality the further things are away from your camera. And there you have it. 7 tips I wish I knew when I started. Hopefully at least one of these things will help you on your journey, and I hope you stick around for more videos. If you do, like this video, subscribe to keep updated, and I'll see you in the next one.